Yeah, that's just as well. Yeah, that's good.
Did you see the one, Mr. B taking the test there?
Oh,
yeah. All the tricks are wrong.
I don't know what they've done with the website, but I do not like it. It doesn't look the same as what I have at work. They keep messing with it.
We're rolling.
I'm not rolling yet.
Yeah, well, he's going to roll as soon as he's ready. We're ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I see we got a few new faces. Did we get someone new here, Jay? Somebody new here? No? Yeah.
Oh, he wasn't here.
Yeah.
I wasn't here.
That's fine. Okay. All right.
Bill.
Bill. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, as you know, my name is Alan McLean, VE3 RET. They asked me to teach the regulations. Most people, they teach the regulations, they'll go through them, and they'll make you memorize them, and they'll bring you to that thing. I'm not going to do that, because part of my job is to use the regulations every day. I've used them for years, and I've come up with a little document I call Keys to Knowing the Regulations. It contains basic, all-encompassing statements. If you remember these statements, you will always know the regulations, because they're all based on these statements. I'm going to hand you these handouts, and we're just going to walk through them. And then when we're done that, I'll show you a couple things on the web here where to look for stuff. And then I'm going to be open to questions about any subject that you've covered. You can talk about or readjust or whatever you need. Clarify. So, these are my little documents here. Should probably leave all these with you and give them to the people that don't show up.
Okay, good.
And Mike might even, I might even give the file to Mike. He can put it on the website.
Good ideas.
Okay, so we're going to walk through these little statements, and I'm just going to elaborate a little bit. And if you can get these in your head, you don't have to memorize all the rules, because they're here in front of you. First thing, the authority for all the regulations, enforcement, offenses, and penalties, they're in the Radio Communication Act. That's the ultimate document. It covers all radio systems everywhere. Everything goes back to the Radio Communication Act. There's nothing that they can write in the radio communications regulations that doesn't go back to the powers that are given to them through the Radio Communication Act. And Industry Canada is responsible for the administration of the Radio Communication Act. All radio services are defined within the radio communication regulations. So radio services are not talked about in the Radio Communication Act. They're talked about specifically in the radio communication regulations. Amateurs may not transmit out of band, nor communicate with stations outside of the amateur service. If you remember this, there's about 6 questions that you've just been given the answer to. And this will come up over and over and over again. All transmissions must be identified with the call sign associated with the station. Stations must identify at the beginning, end, and at 30-minute intervals. This is very important. You will be tested on that question. False or deceptive signals are not permitted under any circumstances, no matter how they word the question. There is no age requirement for an amateur radio certificate, but in order to have one, you must have a valid Canadian address. Restricted operator certificates are not considered equivalent to an amateur certificate. Such certificates would be the radio operator certificate aeronautical, radio operator certificate maritime that you need for your boats, for your marine radio, the maritime commercial, any of those, they're not going to hand you an amateur radio certificate because you have one of those. Sorry.
There's one general on that.
There is one, it's not issued anymore. There is a general certificate. Some of the old guys still have them. And there's also one called an RGMC. The reason that those are considered, we'll hand an advanced amateur certificate over the counter to anyone who presents us with one of those, is because in order to get one of those certificates back when they were issued, you not only had to be able to operate the equipment, you had to take it apart and fix it at sea, or wherever you had, whatever parts you had to maintain your antennas, you had to send and receive Morse code transmissions, so you had to do it all. So if you got that certificate, you're an advanced amateur. No radio license is required. You do not need a radio license to operate an amateur radio station in Canada. You do, however, require a certificate, an operator's certificate. That's your authority to operate. We don't issue radio station licenses for amateurs anymore. Haven't done it for years. And only amateur radio stations may be operated under an amateur radio certificate. If you think that you can operate marine radio because you have an amateur advanced, sorry, no, you're going to have to get the certificate like everybody else. It's not a blanket certificate, it's not the be-all and end-all. You may not install, repair, or maintain amateur equipment for anyone not holding an amateur radio certificate. And that goes for advanced operators as well. Nobody may. And stations may only be operated by or under the control of an amateur radio operator. If you don't have a certificate, you're not to be operating any equipment. And which means that you don't let someone else operate your station while you're not there who doesn't have a certificate. That's illegal. Yes?
Can they sit down and operate it while you're there?
Yes, that's why I said under the control of. Yes. And that's good because that's how a lot of amateurs train up their families in that. As long as you're in their room and you're able to take control of the station, they can do their thing. But you remain responsible for anything they do wrong. So you're going to want to keep near, make sure they're trained right. You have to be able to take physical control of the station. Letting them play with the station while you're downstairs watching a movie, that's pushing it a bit. You're not really monitoring, you're not really, you know. And all equipment must be operated within the rules, regulations, and standards of the Amateur Radio Service. That means you have your Radio Communication Act, you have your Radio Communication Regulations, and then you have your policy documents, which I'm going to talk about. There's 3 basic documents that are, they're sort of work part and parcel with the first 2. Secret codes, ciphers, or protocols may never be used on amateur radio. In other words, if you're doing a transmission that in some way is hiding what the transmission is, it doesn't belong on amateur radio. It's illegal. Only protocols considered to be public domain are permitted. Now, this would cover in your new digital modes. As long as the code is not secret, you haven't employed a cipher within the coding. It's a standard code that's recognized and available for anybody to pick up the standards on and buy the equipment, put in the right protocols, and be able to monitor it. You can use it, like your P25 and stuff like that. You can use that. Broadcasts to the general public are prohibited. Amateur radio is not a broadcast station. It's not for broadcasting to non-amateurs. It's not for running music and all that other stuff. Not permitted.
But if you had music in the background, well,
you are subject to censure or problems if someone complains about it, because it's all copyrighted and there's all these other factors. You know. I mean, a responsible amateur is not going to play rock or play music loud, almost as loud as he's talking in his radio, because you just don't do that. You know, you turn down, you're talking. Nobody wants to try and listen to your voice over music, and it is prohibited. And that comes right back to the next section: business, commercial, recorded material, or music are prohibited. You can't run a business on amateur. Transmissions may only include information of a personal or technical nature. So sort of expanding on the first one. It's really what the hobby's about. And as I mentioned before, the station operator or certificate holder is responsible for the operation of the station. Secondary users may not interfere with, nor will they be protected from interference from primary users. Primary user is a person that's been assigned exclusive use of a frequency, well, not quite exclusive, but main use, so that they have top-notch authority on it, and no one is allowed to interfere with their operations. If they do, then they have to get off. Secondary user is a person who can operate, but if their operations begin to cause problems to a primary user, they have to get off. Amateur equipment requires no approval or certification. Unlike the Americans' radio systems and that, even their amateur equipment has to be FCC approved. That is not the case in Canada.
But if I, as a basic, I can't build them, I can only buy them.
I'm getting to that. I'll explain that to you. That's coming. Okay. They don't have to be approved. No amateur equipment needs to be approved. But I'll get to what you're talking about. Radio equipment used in other services does require approval and certification. So if you're not using it in the amateur bands, then it has to be approved for the particular band that's being used. And amateur radio stations may operate at any location within Canada. All frequencies are shared on a first-on basis. So you're not supposed to interfere with someone who's got the frequency. Go somewhere else. Wait your turn. Vice versa, they're not supposed to break on you. Interference to communications is called harmful interference. That's a term you'll see in our documents and stuff. Harmful interference is basically anything that repeatedly interrupts the operation of a system. If it just happens every 10 minutes, that's not harmful interference. Harmful interference repeatedly disrupts the operation of a communications. That's the only time we call it harmful. Amateur communications may be divulged, but the transmissions of other services may not be. What I mean by that is if you hear it from an amateur radio station, you can talk about it with other people, you can tell them what you heard. But if you're tuning around outside the amateur bands, as these radios will do, you may hear something that's not from the amateur bands, and that's protected under the Secrecy Act. You could get into trouble for what you hear. So you need to keep those things to yourself. If you should hear any.
So that would be
Police, military, whatever things you find. Yeah. That covers your scanners as well. Yes. No fees may be charged in regard to the operation of an amateur radio station. So you can't charge somebody for running communications to them. That's sort of a commercial act again. And stations may communicate in any known language. All stations must have a reliable means of determining the operating frequency of the transmitter. Several questions we'll deal with. It's good to remember. This is what we want. The department wants to know that you're going to operate your equipment without causing interference. You're going to be on the right frequency. You're going to be operating at the right power. Those are the biggies. And the modulation of a radio telephony transmission, which is like your voice, cannot exceed 100%. You're going to see that a lot too. As soon as you exceed 100% of your radio theory, you start creating splatter and more spurious emissions on other frequencies, because you're overloading your transmitter. You don't gain anything by doing that. It also sounds terrible. Most radios have built-in limiters to keep the modulation at about 90 to 95%. Canada has no third-party restrictions. And that means that you can give a message. Operators should respect the restrictions that are imposed by some of the countries. So if you're dealing with a country who doesn't allow third-party traffic, so you can't pass a message to someone in that country on behalf of somebody else. There's a list that's published by the ITU. You'll have to go on the ITU site to get it. The department does not track it, but that's just so you know. There are some countries that don't allow it. As I mentioned here on 33 there, third-party communications are prohibited by some countries. The ITU maintains a list. Canadian amateur call signs will begin with VA, VE, VO, or VY. That's your regular call signs. There are special event call signs that use other prefixes. Those won't be on the exam. Radio control of models is permitted on frequencies above 30 megahertz. Now there are specific frequencies that are allocated for that. I'm not going to go into them. I think they're in the 72 megahertz range. But the important thing is to know no remote control on any frequencies below 30 megahertz, because that's what you're going to be tested for in some form on the examination. They want you to know no radio control of devices above or below 30 megahertz on the HF bands. Another biggie that's going to be in there in one form or another, for frequencies below 30 megahertz, frequency stability must be comparable to that of a crystal, which means this is put in there from the old days because the crystal was found to be very, very stable and kept the frequency quite well. Now we have phase lock loops, which are just as stable. So now they just don't say controlled with a crystal, they say comparable to. And as I mentioned before, stations must also comply with the regulations of the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. There's a statement to that effect in the radio communication regulations. Antenna installations are governed by Industry Canada. That means that the department has final say as to whether or not an antenna installation can be installed. That said, the department doesn't get involved in most of the smaller systems, the amateurs. It's usually between the community and the amateur. The amateur doesn't try to put something up that's too crazy. It usually doesn't have too many problems. The department will get involved in an advisory capacity if there's an impasse. And there have been cases where the department has told the municipality that they have no valid reason and that the person can do what they're going to do. That's rare, but it does happen. Exempted antenna installations are not required to contact their municipality or land use authority. It's along the same lines of what I mentioned. There's a list. I'm getting to that. The exemption is laid out in the departmental document, which I'll show you. It's called CPC 2-2-03, which is the radio communication and antenna structures. And it has a section in it for exemptions. Most amateur systems will meet it. MCAB 2 is another document. It deals with the resolution of RF interference to radio sensitive devices. This document gives levels that, in the case if the department was to do an investigation for an interfering situation of a piece of non-radio equipment, television, radio, whatever, they would go in and do measurements, and if at the point where that piece of equipment is located there are certain levels were exceeded, they would say that it's the fault of the radio transmitter, and the operator would have to make adjustments so that that doesn't happen again. If it's below that level, they would say that it's the result of poor design, and the person that owns the equipment will have to do something. We don't make a lot of those. They're usually not necessary. If people keep the lines of communication open and work together, we don't get that point. RF exposure limits are set by Health Canada under a Safety Code 6 document. Get that off their website. But Safety Code 6 is the one. All amateurs are expected to comply with that. So basically, most amateur systems will comply with it if they're well up in the air and away from the houses and that. But the ones that are really close to the ground and that are really close to somebody's outfit and they're running high power amplifiers, you might want to go through the calculations and make sure that you're within that range. Because if you're not, well, then you're in violation of your certificate.
So can the students get that from Health Canada?
Yes, it's downloadable on their website.
Safety
Called
Code 6?
Safety Code 6. Yeah.
And they should read it for the test?
No,
They don't need to read it?
no. There's a couple things they'll need to know about. I'm going to talk about them
Oh, okay.
in the document. Okay, exemptions. When the rules can be broken. For immediate protection of life or property. And in responding to distress communications which appear to be unheard by other stations. In that case, the rules used to have this all written up, but they don't so much. It's not as clear as it used to be. It basically said in an emergency situation, the operator should use the frequencies that are assigned for their whatever use and whatever means and power necessary. Failing to obtain aid, they then make use of any mode, frequency, or power required to get attention for their emergency. So that's in a life-threatening, protection, life and property. And if you're worried about it, you better be able to give a good account of that this was a real emergency. Case in point, there was an amateur radio operator who thought he was pretty clever. He had himself a nice little radio. He programmed it up to the local police repeater system, complete with their codes and their access codes and everything, all built, all programmed into this thing. Frequency, all set to go. He was involved. He came across an accident and tried to use his local repeater and couldn't do that. So he flipped to that frequency and called directly to the police system. The police responded and they took care of it, but in the aftermath, the fellow ended up being charged for having an illegal radio, for using it in an illegal manner without a license, and a few other things. Why? Because he neglected to notice that there are houses all around. He could have used a telephone. He didn't have to turn on his... And the big question was, what are you doing with a radio that's pre-programmed for police radio frequencies with their subaudible tones if you didn't intend to use it? So there's a, there's a line. So he got charged from us, and he got charged from the police as well. Scanner, listener, you can do it with any scanner.
Oh, okay.
Some of our amateur radios can be programmed to listen to a frequency and pick the tone off. And then you just program it into the memory. No, not directly. It's all digital. You have to decrypt it, and owning a decrypted device is illegal as well. So that's another. Okay, mode bandwidths. See, our department doesn't go into a lot of fancy rules about what modes you can use on different frequencies. Everything is based on power and bandwidth. So CW, of course, is 1 kilohertz. We all know that. That's a standard. And single sideband is typically 2.8 kilohertz. You know that. AM is 6 kilohertz and FM is 15 kilohertz. Here's the rub. 6 kilohertz is the maximum bandwidth for HF. So if you look at those frequencies in the list that's in the RBR, Schedule 1, it states the bandwidths. and that frequency, the frequency range for HF, nothing can go above 6 kilohertz. So that's really all you need to know about that. Maximum bandwidth 6 kilohertz. There are no mode restrictions.
10.1.
We'll get to that. Getting to that. 10.1 is another one. Because the band is so narrow, it actually can't handle wide bandwidth. So you're really limited only to CW for that reason.
That's only 1 kilohertz.
Yes, 1 kilohertz because it's CW only. Exactly. It's bandwidth again. See, that's how it works. 15 kilohertz is allowed at frequencies above 30 megahertz. You'll notice that, and that's what you need for FM. So you're not running FM on HF. It's not allowed. So that's bandwidth in a nutshell. And slow scan TV, that's way up there, and those ranges can be 140, 2.5, or 500 kilohertz.
You also have a question on there with high scan as well.
Yes.
It's about
Yeah, that's for it's up higher,
around 400.
and you'll see the bands. Roland probably knows what the limit is on that. I can't think of that right off. What's your what's the bandwidth for your high speed scan TV you're running?
I can't hear you.
What bandwidth are you running on your transmitter for your TV?
Oh, the television station, the channel is 6 megahertz.
6 megahertz, so it's a standard channel. Yeah. Okay. Special. You mentioned the 10.1 megahertz. That's one. Yes. That's so narrow that you actually couldn't get a sideband in there. So it is 1 kilohertz, and you'll see that in the document. It'll state maximum bandwidth 1 kilohertz. That's why that. Recently, we had, in addition to our band, we were given 5 discrete frequencies called 30-meter band. And you have your 2 sidebands, upper and lower. And we talked about sideband suppresses the carrier. So the radio is tuned to this frequency on the dial. But when you go to upper sideband, you're using a band of frequencies that are centered on this frequency. And when you go to lower sideband, you're using a group of frequencies that are centered on this frequency. Even though that dial says you're here, in reality, your emission is actually centered 1.5 kilohertz, either the upper or lower sideband. What this means for these discrete frequencies is that you don't tune your radio to 5.332, which would be 5.332. You actually have to tune your radio up to a frequency of 1.5 kilohertz, right? 5.3335. And that's where you operate, because it actually shifts it. That's a good thing to know. You have to make that adjustment.
I thought the rule said that on was it 14 megahertz you use the lower sideband. Here they're saying that even 5 megahertz you use the upper sideband.
This is a special case. That's what I'm talking about. This special band. Only upper sideband is allowed. You can't use lower sideband. Can't use Morse code. It's all voice. And the reason for that is it has to be compatible with the other outfits that are using these frequencies, so they can tell who you are and report you if you're causing problems, because you're a secondary user. It's more of an operating thing. I don't think it'll be on the test. Just something to keep in mind. Because what will happen is you'll tune to that frequency and you're going to say, I'm going to use that new band. And everybody's way over here. I can't hear them until I turn the dial here. That's because they have to go over.
Can you give me one example, like for the mode bandwidths or CW?
Yes?
Say you're at 3 kilohertz.
Yeah.
So that would mean you're plus or minus half a kilohertz, right? That's what they talk about bandwidth.
Yes. Yeah. Your center of your bandwidth would be plus or minus 1.5 at 3 kilohertz. Yes. 1.5 this way, 1.5 that way. Total bandwidth 3 kilohertz. But CW would be much narrower. Be plus or minus 50 hertz. Or, no, 500 hertz. 500 hertz.
That's what I meant,
Yeah.
Minus 500 hertz.
Yeah. Okay. Covered that. Basic privileges, very easy to figure out. They're real simple. Basic have all frequencies above 30 megahertz. They may use commercially designed equipment only. We're coming to your question. Maximum power, 560 watts peak envelope power. That's for sideband. 190 watts carrier. That would be other modes. And this can also be limited by 250 watts DC input. The reason that they use these two different methods is because some manufacturers specify PEP, some specify DC input. The rule of thumb is that a system that has 250 watts of DC input can't put out any more than 190 watts PEP or 560 watts typically. You can install and operate cross-band repeaters. That is a repeater that doesn't require a duplexer, that can operate between one band and the other. So it listens on one band, retransmits on the other. You cannot install a repeater that operates, transmit, and receive within the same band. You have to have an advanced certificate for that. Those systems require more technical expertise to set up and maintain. If you get your basic with honors, which is 80% or more with this test, you get the extra. You may access all frequencies below 30 megahertz, which is basically your HF bands. So a straight basic person cannot use HF. They're stuck with the VHF, UHF, low VHF. But if you get your 80% or higher, you automatically get access to the HF bands. Advanced. You get all the frequencies. You can build, design, modify, and maintain radio transmitter equipment. You can use a maximum power of 2,260 watts peak envelope power, 750 watts carrier, or 1,000 watts DC input in your transmitter. You may operate in-band and remotely control fixed radio stations. And you can sponsor a club radio station. That's what you gain if you get your advanced. Now, another way to get your HF privileges if you didn't get your 80 is 5 words per minute Morse code. That'll also get you the same thing as your basic with honors. So there's 2 ways to get it. 3 actually, for your advanced. Okay, here's some general recommendations. Commit the frequencies in Schedule 1 in RVR4 to memory. Know the bands. Know their frequency ranges and their meters as to what band they're considered, because the question could be both, or it could say that a station transmitting in such a meter band would be operating in the range of. So they'd be testing you to see if you can do. Note which bands are shared or have restrictions. Example, bandwidth and power. Note Section 7 of CPC 2-0-03. That's the antenna system exemption document. Section 7 has your exemption in it. And it says here, no meters versus frequency bands. I just covered that. Review the policy questions in the question bank. Sections B001, 001, 002, 003. Those are all the questions that it could possibly ask. They're in the question bank. You want to look at them. Golden rule when you take any of these tests, read the question carefully. Cannot emphasize this enough, but I will continue to emphasize it some more. Not correct versus is correct. They're really nasty about that. They really try to trip you up.
Who did that?
I don't know. Oh, who did it? It's amateurs. The amateurs wrote these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, but you know what? That's in my books anyway. I may be wrong here, but you know, what purpose does that serve? I mean,
I guess they want to see if you're paying attention.
Well, but
You need to have attention when you're using your radios.
It's trying to.
Yeah, I know. It's a little dirty pool, I think.
I would say.
Yeah. True versus not true. Another good one. So when you're reading these questions, make sure you go, not true, not true, not true, not true. No, you think true. Not true. Otherwise, you'll get all messed up. You'll give the wrong answer. No. Note, here's the part about safety code 6. Note the frequency exposure limits for safety code 6 maximum to minimum effect. In other words, which frequency ranges are less tolerant for levels wise? That's going to be on the exam. The lower the frequency or the higher the frequency. That much they'll ask. And of course, with all these exams, 3 answers are usually nonsense. So if you really don't know what's going on, try and get rid of the real dumb ones and then narrow it down. And there are some real dumb ones in there. And again, watch for correct versus incorrect terminology. They're trying to trick you. In the final statement for this document, if your answer conflicts with any of these key statements, it's most likely incorrect. So there's a little simplified study guide for you. And just for, where is it now? Yesterday, I got kind of stumped on the electrical system for houses. You know, sometimes you don't have everything right at your fingertips. A good idea is if you can't remember or can't be sure of some things, you should always have a good library at home to refer to stuff. And the question was about the neutral wires when you're wiring up a panel. A couple interesting things going on there, and that's where a little bit of confusion. So I looked into my little reference book here. Essentially what happens is you have your 3 wires that come in from the service. You have your neutral and you have your 2 hots, each one of which could deliver 120 volts on their own or 240 volts between them. The neutral goes to a bus bar that's common to all the white wires that go in your house. It also is bounded to another bus bar that they connect all of the non-covered wires, your grounding wires, at the main panel. So they are bonded together with the neutral. However, once you get to a bus panel or an extension from the fuse box, they don't bond them anymore. They run one wire out that goes to another common bus bar, and then all of the grounds go to that one. They don't go back to the panel. So a little bit of a twist there.
I know the main panel.
The main panel's the neutral states.
So I know
Yep.
both of them were bolted to the case.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But you will get a circuit from one side to ground.
Yes.
Like you put it across these 2, you get a circuit.
Yep.
You put it across this one and that one.
Yep.
You may not get a circuit, but you put it across this one and that one, you will get a circuit.
Yeah.
There's one
Yes.
slack,
120
one's
volts to
which is
Yeah.
same as the ground, so there's no power going there.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why you get it on one side.
However, because they're not directly bonded, there is a possibility that some voltage potential could be built up between the wire that's got no voltage and the ground because of the extra resistance of the wires running around. You could get 10, 15, 20 volts or more.
And
between
keep in
it.
mind, there's no fuse on that side either.
Yeah.
So it can draw as many amps as it wants.
Yeah. But I've done that. I put my hand on the white wire things on the panel, and you don't get nothing. Unless you got to wear your shoes, though.
Well,
if you're
yeah.
got less potential than the ground.
If you're sweeter ground than the electrical system.
General rules on the panel,
Yes.
you can touch the white wires and the ground wires, but you don't want to touch the black or the red.
Yeah. But in case you forget, don't touch any of them.
Don't touch. That's right. That's the best way.
Don't touch any of them. Turn the power off.
Would they ground to on a plane? On a plane in the air that doesn't have.
It's a floating ground.
So they would ground to
Chassis.
the body?
Chassis.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same thing in like space. They would.
Yep. Yep.
Is that
Floating
like
ground. Same in a boat.
What is it like? Like is it just like
Just a common bus bar
Okay.
location.
And it dissipates, or it takes.
It just completes the electrical circuit.
Is it a worse ground than, say, actually physically to the ground, or?
Well, yeah, there's potential between that fuselage and the aircraft and the ground.
Okay.
So lightning could.
So there's like other standards that they have to adhere to.
Yes, they bond the aircraft and they do a couple of little things, and they have their own lightning rod protection. That's a whole nother story. We don't cover that in amateur.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay, so put this out of the way. Don't need that. Okay, so I'm going to try and navigate through our little website here and show you a couple things. It's not the same as what I'm used to. I'm not sure whether. Keep trying to get to the one I'm used to, and it's not coming up. So, but this has the information. So basically, we have down here is you have your radio information circulars, RICs. You'll see those in the list, documents available to the public. And the one that we're concerned about is the RIC3, Information on the Amateur Radio Service. Now that document is a general document, contains a few policies that are enforceable under the radio communication regulations, but they're not in the regulations per se. And basically, you know, that's why these are in here, to kind of clarify things. They're getting better. Some of these older documents, they're really not that clear. I've been trying to get them to redo them, and we're supposed to bring out some new versions soon, and hopefully they're going to listen to what I've been telling them and make some of the changes. Then I don't have to keep answering the same questions all the time. But you see, it just gives you some general information about the operation. It gives you a list of what you need to study, what each section is. Doesn't give you the information, just gives you the headings. Tells you a little bit about Morse code and how it's marked and so on. Again, just lists of the information that you should be familiar with in order to pass the test. Tells you about the international amateur radio permits and the SEP permits for operating outside of other countries. A few extracts from the regulations. Some of these will be taken out. These won't be in the new one. There's no need to keep quoting these regs. We'll just make proper statements that'll cover it all, similar to what I did with this. And you could read the regs if you want to, but as long as you follow those statements, you won't need to know all the nitty-gritty. Stay out of trouble. This one is the oldest document. This is probably going to disappear in another form or other. The one that's the most revamped, and it's also due for another revamp, is RBR4. It's your major document, and it's a good one to be familiar with. I'm going to get out of the RIC section here. RBRs. These are actual legislative and regular circulars. Regulation by what's it called now? Regulation by reference. Regulation by reference. They're referenced right in the radio communication regulations, and they state that you are to comply with those and the contents of this. So the other stuff will probably be moved into the RBRs. So the one we want here is RBR4. Regulation by reference, that's the one. This is the one with the schedule in it that we were talking about. Gives you the actual frequencies at the back. Gives you elaborates a little bit more on your privileges, some of the definitions of some of the terms. It'll tell you your maximum powers and your requirements to get a certificate. Some certificate equivalencies we talked about, which ones are considered equivalent to amateur. There are a few. It'll talk about foreign stations operating in Canada, USA. It'll refer to an agreement known as the Reciprocal Operating Agreement. That's one you'll need to know about. it basically is an agreement between Canada and the United States that allows amateurs to operate without any further contacting of each other's administrations. They just can come right over and set up stations for the time they're visiting. There's no particular length of time considered for it. It's just considered to be temporary. So wherever they want to draw the line is what's not temporary and not temporary. I haven't been able to find it yet, but you're basically allowed to operate your station on all the modes that you are allowed and the frequencies that you are allowed, as long as they do not conflict with the Americans' restrictions, and it's the same when they come over here. And then
If it's a permanent move, you have to get their.
Yes,
there's
you need to get their certificate. Same in Canada. But that's what this document contains. This I mentioned the prefixes for specific ones. It might not hurt to get these to memory, because I believe there are some questions that will say a prefix of VO1 would be the province of. The VE and VAs are pretty well all the provinces. You've got the VOs and VYs are all either your Yukon territories or your East Coast. Those are the two areas you're going to see those. So it narrows it down a bit for you. Also on this website, Spectrum Management Telecommunications, there will be a link right to amateur stuff. And it was at the beginning here. Information, share, guidelines, forms. One back. No. Find the darn thing. Broadcasting guidelines. I can't find it right off, but when you get into the main site, there'll be a section just say amateur. You click on that, and it'll link you to all the amateur stuff, including the amateur center, the testing programs, everything all together. But this site I'm not recognizing. I don't know where they got this from. This is not what comes up on my desktop in the morning. It's like a mobile site. This thing shouldn't be wired as mobile. It should be a desktop.
It doesn't say anything in the URL either.
No.
It looks just like a desktop.
Where's that little tool that you can use, force it to go desktop? Mike?
Well, at the bottom of the screen, they have some, like sometimes on the website, it's like go.
Mike, you know this this browser. How can I force it to the desktop site on Chrome?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That looks like my desktop site.
Really?
It looks like
That's not Chrome either, that's,
some new
what
Windows.
is it? Well, that is.
Yeah, it is Chrome.
It's Chrome.
That looks
Okay,
like some
that's
Windows
better.
10 stuff over there.
Yeah,
Scroll to the bottom of the
That's
screen,
There's nothing there.
at the very bottom. There.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's like.
try it in the browser, Al.
If you want to go back to the desktop, you want?
Yeah,
Okay, hit the Windows key.
Windows key.
Sorry, I'm thinking about this here.
On the keyboard.
On keyboard.
Keyboard.
Well, that just puts you on the Windows
Yeah.
desktop.
No, I want to. There's a feature
Desktop
in browsers that allows you to force it to go to a desktop site when it wants to make you a mobile.
Oh, that, yeah.
Yeah. I thought it would be here.
It's weird because it doesn't look like mobile. Like in the URL.
It's not there.
Doesn't look
It
right.
usually says add dot.
Doesn't look right. But anyway, that's what I wanted to show you. Those are where you get your documents. That's where you'll find them. The MCABs as well, they're all in there. You don't really need to know those. Be good information later, but you don't really need to know those. Okay, so that's that. All right, so that said, we could have a 10-minute break.
Just one thing before we break out.
Yeah.
In the United States, they have this ability in emergency situations for amateurs to communicate with the military.
Yes, the MARS system.
The MARS system, is that's not available in Canada?
No.
Okay.
what we have in Canada is the, what do they call it now? CFARS, Canadian Forces Amateur Service.
Okay.
And they're specific stations, like the Mars. They are specific stations with special privileges. They're allowed to operate on specific frequencies that have been assigned to the military that are close to the amateur frequencies, but they are not amateur frequencies.
As amateurs are assigned to those frequencies?
They're amateurs that have been approved by the military,
Oh, okay.
and they have special call signs that they use. They may not use those call signs on amateur bands. They may not have any traffic or link anything they do to amateur. So they are not operating as an amateur radio station when they are doing this. They're off our band.
Okay.
They are amateurs,
Yes.
but they are operating on military affiliated frequencies.
Is that for like contract work or something?
That's for emergency and communications, providing communications to soldiers at home and things that are out in the field.
So you as an
Phone
amateur
patches and
did
stuff like
special
that.
Training and then you would
Yeah,
get on.
you would apply to the CFARS organization and have a website, and you can say, I'd like to be included in this group, and then you will get a special certificate that gives a list of frequencies you will be able to use. But in order to do this, you'll have to go through a certain qualification. You have to have certain abilities for your station. You'll need to have emergency power. You'll need to have a transmitter of at least so many watts. A whole bunch of different things. You have to meet a minimum criteria to
And
be
you have
considered.
to modify the radio, too.
In some cases, you need to modify the radios, yes.
Yeah.
Most of them you don't, though.
Oh, okay.
So we take about a 5 or 6 minute break now. We'll come back, and then you can hit me with any question about any subject and we'll see if we can clear some things up for you.